Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 36, Population Ecology. We talked about population density. We talked about limiting factors. We talked about biotic potential. With limiting factors, there's something that is going to prevent the population from growing continuously. One of the things that happens when you have a population that is growing or a very dense population, is called intraspecific competition. Intra means within. Specific refers to species, and obviously they're competing with one another. As you have a large population or a very dense population, what happens is they begin to compete with one another. They're competing for those nesting sites. They're competing for food. They're competing for water. So a larger population, a more dense population, you're going to have a lot more competition. And competition in nature is actually, well, it's not that good. It can be good if you want to think about it in terms of only the fittest survive. But as far as an individual is concerned, competition is not good for an individual, because the individual is having to waste resources competing with the other individual instead of putting those resources towards taking care of themselves or putting those resources towards the next generation. So for a species, competition is good. For an individual, competition is bad. Two kinds of controls that you will have on a population. The first is density-dependent controls. Density-dependent controls means these controls come into effect the more densely populated a population becomes. Food availability, water availability, shelter availability, we already talked about those limiting factors. Those are all density-dependent controls. If there's not enough food, that's going to control the population. If there's not enough water, if there's not enough shelter, that's going to control the population. That's going to limit their growth. Disease is also a population control. As populations become more dense, disease spreads faster. If diseases are spreading faster or easier, that means that individuals are going to die faster. A disease is going to be much more, have a much greater impact on a more densely populated group of individuals. Population controls, density-dependent population control. The population is being influenced by the availability of food, water, and shelter, and disease. You can also have density-independent controls, things that will control a population not because of how big it is, but simply control it because this is going to wipe out a bunch of individuals. A density-independent population control is almost always a natural disaster. A fire, a storm, habitat destruction by human activity, seasonal changes like the first hard freeze in the winter killing off all the bugs, density-independent controls. They will limit the spread of the growth. It'll limit the growth of a population without any regard to how big the population was. If there was 10 individuals or 1,000 individuals, it wiped them all out, so that stopped their growth. In the real world, yes, catastrophes happen, yes, storms, whatnot happens, but this is a lot more common. Seasonal weather changes. A drought, preventing plants from growing, a drought, killing off a bunch of animals. Seasonal changes, freezing, killing off a whole bunch of bugs. So here we see the population of the bug increasing throughout the summer months, increase, until, bam, it freezes, and then they die. And then what happens is the eggs will overwinter, and then in spring, the eggs will hatch, and they're back again. This is why, we're going to start hearing cicadas pretty soon. It is April now. We'll start hearing them probably about 3 months, 2-3 months. We'll start hearing them somewhere around July. Cicadas are the sound of hot. Bzz, 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 bzz. You know it's hot when you hear those things outside. Cicadas. Why aren't we hearing them now? Because the adults are dead. They froze when it got cold. Stable populations are called or referred to as K-selected. K refers to that carrying capacity. A stable population will hover around the carrying capacity, which means they don't go much below it, they don't go much above it. Stable populations really only exist in stable ecosystems, where you can count on the weather being stable at certain times of the year. They can count on food availability to be constant throughout the year. You can count on water availability to be constant throughout the year. There are lots of K-selected populations. It's not as common on land because land is inherently unstable. And the reason why land is inherently unstable is because you can't always count on water. Rather, land is much less stable. Any kind of ecosystem on land is going to be less stable than an ecosystem in water, because water, the one thing that you never have to worry about in water is water. If you live on land, you do have to worry about water availability. When we go through these drought periods, what happens is lots of things die because there's not enough water. You don't have that if you live in water. If you live in a freshwater stream, if you live in the ocean, you never have to worry about water availability. Because you never have to worry about water availability, because you generally don't have to deal with rapid temperature changes, aquatic environments are always more stable than terrestrial environments, and therefore you're going to find a lot of our K-selected populations, a lot of our stable populations are going to be found in aquatic habitats. There are stable populations on land, since there's a lot more of them in water. Unstable populations will shoot past that carrying capacity and then will plummet below it, and they'll have what are called boom and bust years. Stable populations are referred to as K-selected. Unstable populations are referred to as being R-selected. We'll talk more about K and R selection in just a little bit. Boom and bust cycles. Boom and bust cycles will revolve around food shortages and predator-prey interactions. I love this graphic. So this graphic is rabbit and bobcat populations in Canada, going all the way back to 1850 until about 1950, give or take. So roughly a century of data of rabbit and bobcat populations. The black line on the graphic is the rabbit's population. The red line is the bobcat population. What do you see? First of all, you see obvious boom-bust years. A boom cycle is when the population increases dramatically. This is talking about 150,000 rabbits. Notice how most of the time the bobcat population lags behind by about 1 or 2 years. We have a huge increase in rabbits. About 2 years later, we have a big increase in bobcats. We have a big bust with rabbits. About a year later, we have a big bust with bobcats. Big increase in rabbits, big increase in bobcats, big increase in rabbits, big increase in bobcats. It lags behind about a year or two because their population, this is quite obvious that the bobcat population is extremely dependent upon the rabbit population for food. This is a great example of boom-bust years. This is a great example of an R-selected population, specifically the rabbits. And because these guys are R-selected, it makes the bobcats have to be R-selected as well because this is their food source they depend on. The last thing that I want to point out, and one thing that's really, really intriguing about this particular graphic is, all right, 1850, do you think there are biologists out there with tags and notebooks writing down how many rabbits they found, how many bobcats? Did they do market recapture on these guys? No, 1850 they were not doing that. So how do we have these numbers? How do we know how big the populations were? These data were retroactively determined by looking at records of pelts that were sold. They looked at how many pelts were bought and sold in Canada throughout these years. And businessmen are definitely going to take meticulous records about how many pelts they bought, how many pelts they sold. And by determining how many pelts were bought and sold, they can determine what the overall population was. If there's a whole bunch of pelts that were sold, that means there are a whole bunch of animals. Boom and bust. Really neat.